In May 1798, one of the largest military forces France had ever assembled disappeared into the Mediterranean. At Toulon, more than 30,000 soldiers boarded a vast fleet of warships and transports. Artillery, horses, engineers, supplies, and months of provisions went with them. Then the fleet sailed east and vanished beyond the horizon. Most of the men aboard had not been told their destination. Some guessed Sicily. Others expected an attack on Britain, or perhaps a move against the Ottoman Empire. Even among senior officers, information was tightly restricted, and fuller orders emerged only as the voyage continued. Across Europe, governments watched the coast and traded rumors. A force large enough to alter the war had left France, yet no one could say where it would strike. Only one fact was certain. Napoleon Bonaparte was in command. Somewhere at sea, he was carrying the French Republic toward a gamble that no European power yet fully understood. While Napoleon disappeared eastward, one British commander was trying to find him. Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson knew a major French expedition had sailed, but not where it would strike. A storm had scattered his scouting frigates, the smaller ships that served as a fleet's eyes, leaving him to search with heavy ships of the line and incomplete reports. By June 22, Nelson had concluded that Egypt was the likeliest target. That night, his squadron passed close to the French convoy. Through fog and darkness, the French could hear distant British signal guns, but neither side saw the other. Nelson raced ahead and reached Alexandria on June 28. The harbour was empty. Convinced he had guessed wrong, he turned away and continued the search. 25 hours later, Napoleon's fleet appeared off the same coast. Nelson had found the destination and missed the army. On the 1st of July 1798, the mystery ended off Alexandria. French boats began moving toward the Egyptian shore. The expedition had crossed the Mediterranean under strict secrecy, and now its target was finally visible. France had chosen Egypt because Britain could not easily be challenged at home. By taking an Ottoman province in the eastern Mediterranean, the Directory hoped to put pressure on British trade and communications with India without risking a direct invasion of the British Isles. For Napoleon, the campaign also offered distance from Paris and command of a war that would be his own. His victories in Italy had made him famous. Egypt promised a larger stage and a chance to measure himself against the ancient conquerors he admired. None of that mattered unless the army got ashore quickly. Nelson was still searching the Mediterranean, and Alexandria had to be taken before the British fleet returned. The landing began before dawn. Napoleon wanted the army off the ships before Nelson could return, so the first troops went ashore in darkness and advanced on Alexandria almost at once. The city fell quickly, but the victory solved only the most immediate problem. Cairo lay far inland, and the road toward it crossed dry country that the French had badly underestimated. Water ran short. Heat slowed the columns, and men who had expected another European campaign found themselves marching through an unfamiliar landscape with little shade and uncertain supplies. The political situation was no simpler. Egypt belonged to the Ottoman Empire in name, while Mamluk leaders held much of the real military power. Taking Alexandria had not removed them. Napoleon could not wait for the army to recover. If he wanted control of Egypt, he had to reach Cairo before the Mamluks could gather their full strength. On July 21, the Mamluk army waited near Cairo. Napoleon's troops had marched through heat and thirst, but once the battle began, the balance changed quickly. The Mamluks were renowned cavalrymen. Their speed and courage were formidable, but they could not break disciplined infantry supported by concentrated fire. The French absorbed the charges and drove Murad Bey's army from the field. Napoleon gave the victory a name built to last: the Battle of the Pyramids. The pyramids were not the objective, yet the title tied a battle near Cairo to the grandeur of ancient Egypt. A few days later, the French entered the capital. The misery of the march now seemed to have produced a decisive result. Cairo was in Napoleon's hands, while Murad Bey retreated with the remnants of his force. News of the victory strengthened the image already created by the Italian campaign. For the French army, this was the expedition's highest point. But the campaign's future no longer depended on victories on land. The warning at the end of the Battle of the Pyramids came true on August 1. Nelson had returned to the Egyptian coast. Late that afternoon, a British lookout found the French battle fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, east of Alexandria. Daylight was already fading, but Nelson attacked without waiting for morning. The French ships were still at anchor when the British entered the bay. Fighting continued into the night. At about 10 o'clock, fire reached the magazine of L'Orient, the French flagship. The explosion lit the coast, destroyed the ship, and briefly silenced the guns around it. By the time the battle ended, most of the French battle fleet had been captured or destroyed. A few ships escaped, but they could no longer protect regular communication with France. The result changed the meaning of everything Napoleon had won on land. Cairo was still occupied, and the army itself had not been defeated. Yet the ships that had carried it to Egypt could no longer bring reliable reinforcements, supplies, or a safe route home. Nelson had spent weeks searching for the expedition. Once he found its fleet, he did not need to defeat Napoleon's army. He only had to leave it stranded. The destruction of the fleet did not make the French army collapse. It changed the kind of war Napoleon now had to fight. Without a secure route across the Mediterranean, reinforcements from France became uncertain. The occupation itself also grew harder to sustain, as new taxes and the presence of a foreign army deepened resentment in Cairo. On October 21, that resentment turned into open revolt. Barricades appeared in the streets, and the French military governor was killed. Napoleon's troops fought their way through the city and suppressed the uprising with severe force. The revolt ended, but it exposed how little the victory at the pyramids had secured. French troops controlled Cairo, but the city had not accepted their rule. Beyond the capital, the Ottoman Sultan had declared war, and forces were being prepared to recover Egypt. Napoleon still held Cairo, but he could no longer treat the campaign as a completed conquest. Napoleon did not wait for the Ottoman counterattack to reach Egypt. In February 1799, he led part of the army across Sinai and into Ottoman Syria, hoping to disrupt the forces gathering against him. The advance carried the French to Acre, a fortified port on the Mediterranean. There, the campaign stalled. The defenders received help from British ships under Sidney Smith, while French siege equipment arrived late or was captured at sea. Repeated assaults failed to break the city. Disease now weakened the army as well. Plague spread among the troops, making a long siege harder to sustain. In May, Napoleon abandoned the attempt and ordered a retreat to Egypt. The march north had not opened a route out of isolation. It had shown that French victories in the field could not overcome every fortified position, especially when Britain still controlled the sea. On the 25th of July 1799, Napoleon met the Ottoman army that had landed at Aboukir. The French drove it back and won another clear victory on Egyptian soil. The result restored some confidence after Acre, but it did not restore the fleet or reopen contact with France. Soon afterward, reports from Europe told Napoleon that the Republic was suffering military setbacks and that the Directory was under growing pressure. He decided to return. The plan was kept within a small circle. On August 23, Napoleon boarded the frigate Muion and slipped past the British patrols. General Kleber was left in command, learning the full reality of the transfer through instructions Napoleon had prepared before sailing. Napoleon could argue that France needed him. To many of the soldiers left behind, the same decision looked like abandonment. The commander who had brought the army east was now going home without it. Napoleon reached France in October 1799. Within weeks, he helped overthrow the Directory and became the Republic's dominant political figure. The army he had left behind remained in Egypt under new commanders. It was still cut off from reliable reinforcement and could no longer achieve the purpose for which the expedition had been launched. The French fought on for nearly 2 more years before surrendering to British and Ottoman forces in 1801. The campaign did leave one unexpected legacy. In 1799, French soldiers found the Rosetta Stone, which later helped scholars decipher ancient Egyptian writing. But that discovery did not change the military result. The expedition that had vanished from Europe ended with its commander back in France and its army trapped abroad. Napoleon returned in time to protect his political future, but France gained no lasting hold over Egypt,